overall in the region, I would say that the response has been very good within the limitations that the countries may have institutionally, and they have tried to do the best under the circumstances. I think that the most important point now is to really understand where are we at in the pandemic. If we are at the point that the pandemic is still not at their highest point, and then we cannot really relax the measures, or the countries already start to relax the measures, as you can hear in Europe as well, in some of the
Yes.
countries in Europe that they started with that process.
Mm.
That is really a very great concern, because if you do it wrong, you may have this game all over again, and
Sure.
even worse. And to do it right, there are great political pressures in the countries for obvious reasons of the economy, that creates that great pressures for each country. So that's really what we are focusing now. I mean, we passed from the stage of focusing on what countries need to do to what type of relaxation measures, or really going back to a certain level of normal, makes sense to each country according to their circumstances.
What do you think are the implications of this in the region for problems that already existed, human security
Mhm.
challenges that were already there?
Sure. I think that that's a very good question. And so far, from the analysis that I have tried to try to put the little pieces together as much as I can, um, and I'm based in this multi-dimension that you mentioned within the human security approach, a way of looking at security. And then if you just don't have to go too far, and then I can tell you about our own experience now coming from environmental public health. One of the main issues is really interesting what we have seen. It has been for me a fascinating social exercise in a way, because on one hand is the issue of accessing water and sanitation, right? I mean, so we always knew that there was a problem with accessing water and sanitation, but once you give the measure to people that they have to wash their hands, many people they say, okay, with what, right? I mean, it's like if you don't have access to safe water, to how are you going to wash your hands, right? For example, water companies in the countries are not servicing certain poor areas. Those poor areas are usually precarious settlements,
Mm.
like what they call favelas in Brazil,
Yes.
or any type of precarious settlements, that their access to water, it is limited.
Mm.
And on top of that, people lose their jobs. And on top of that, they cannot pay for water. So the
Yeah.
people that have access for water, they get cut the water. So
Mm.
the first thing that we did is request to the governments to issue a decree that the water companies cannot disconnect these families from water
Right.
services.
Mm.
Okay, so it's just an example, right? I mean, but it's a good example, I think, to show
Yeah.
the security issues from the human security point of view, right? I mean, if water companies are privatized, which in many cases they are, or
Mm.
they are independent autonomous entities, that they are public-private partnerships in many countries as well, and they're local, but they continue charging their clients for the water services, how governments immediately they issue decrees to not to cancel the services, as an example. Second, if these companies, they have a division of territory, right? Therefore, but in their territory, there are many households that for which they don't provide water, right? Can they provide water by at least installing sinks in the corners of the streets, and with trucks have it provide safe water on a regular basis in this situation? Or
Mm.
they can't. Or how do they do it? How they provide that social service?
Mm.
Eventually, in theory, they divide the territory. So that territory is them. The fact that they don't have it is an issue of a business plan as well, right?
Mm. Mm. Mm.
So it's a combination of how you put your business plan aside in order to provide a public service in this particular moment.
And what are the other perhaps bottlenecks, pressure points, areas where you can intervene, as it were, to make a difference?
This was just in two of the dimensions, looking very briefly on that. Yeah, I mean, it's like if we go to the dimension, for example, one thing that also we started to see that it has to do with conflict, and it has to do more at the personal dimension and community dimension, is all the issue of domestic violence. So we started to see the increase of domestic violence just because the people, by staying in the same household, people that maybe they should not have been in the same household in the first place, primarily women that they should have been in a different place in the first place, but culturally they couldn't do it, and now they find themselves, like, sleeping with the enemy, to put it in that way, and they have no choice because of the lockdowns that we have. That definitely has seen not only an issues of mental health issues and loneliness issue, but directly domestic violence issues.
Is there a role for multi-stakeholder collaborations in addressing some of the really pinch points, the challenges that we see, the access to healthcare, the sanitary issues, and so on?
The short answer is absolutely. The more comprehensive answer to that, to understand it, is depends the case by case and at what level. There is, however, we have to be very careful, because if you don't have a strong institution with strong capacity to really be, on one hand, understand what private sector does best. There are some things that we know that private sector, they do best. A private sector can be innovative, much faster. A private sector can have a supply chain much faster than the government can. Private sector really can move certain products overall in that supply chain and go to the, like Coca-Cola going to communities that they don't even have water, but they have Coca-Cola, right? So definitely there are certain things that the private sector, they can do very, very, very well. And there are certain things that the private sector cannot do. And that's the role of government. However, I think that if you don't, in many countries in Latin America, my concern is that the level of institutionality and the level of professionals in some areas is not good enough, because it goes all the way from a workforce that it's not very well paid, that so therefore the person that end up being the technical person in a ministry of health or in a ministry or certain ministries, it does not have the technical capacity to really deal and converse and negotiate with the private sector that has the muscle in many cases. So that's from that part to extremely corrupt system, so you have go from A to Z, right? From any technical person in the workforce that does not have the technical capacity to negotiate, all the way to a corrupt system that will make deals with disinfection tunnels, right? So you have the whole thing in between. So you have to be very, very careful. So yes. And then the same thing can go at the local level. But one thing is about at the local level work in cities like Rio de Janeiro, in cities like Lima, in cities like Bogota. And another thing is to go to middle-sized to small cities that if there is a mayor and maybe that mayor has two people that work with him, that they are their own advisors, that they founded in the family sometime 3 years ago and they work with him or her, that's what you have.
So what would you say to companies, to private sector that is willing to step up, that sees how this crisis is playing out at local levels, in communities, in parts of cities, in, as you said, favelas and the precarious settlements? If they want to help, it's clearly important that they do so in the right way. What would you say to them to encourage them, but to also make sure this effort is channeled in a positive fashion?
I think that the first thing is really first of all, the question I would have is there is trust between the government and that private business? If there is trust between the private business and the community overall, and assuming that that trust is there, or how that trust needs to be created because they want to do the right things for the right reasons. Then the second thing is to listen. I think that to listen both sides. I think that they need to listen the government because the government has certain views of that, but also to listen the community. I think that one of the things that for us has been one of the greatest challenges is that governments, they always say we need to communicate, you're on risk communication, but very few people, they are working very at the same level on what we say risk perception. So it's really what people really perceive that the risks are more than communicate the risks. And it's not only about explaining what the risks are, but really is that why people perceive what they perceive. You know, and I think private sector, because it's more closer also to marketing and they market products, they understand also how the public can act to certain things if you do it right. And they can definitely help with the risk perception as well. And they help government with risk perception issues and to help with the risk communication issues. I think that they can provide a tremendous service on communicated through their channels, what the real risks are, and to provide that line of trust that I mentioned to you before. That doesn't mean that their product is or not important, but in this case, they are secondary things of what they can do. And I think that they know consumers, they see them as consumers, and therefore they know what ticks as a consumer because that's what they do on a day-by-day basis. Government don't do that well. At the private sector, they know very well how to attract the consumer. So how we can give the right message? What should be the right message? Who's our public? Who is really the population that we want to go? Is the message should go more towards the mother and not towards the father? Should the message go to more towards a teacher, not towards to whom? However, what we see is in the incredible lack of limited trust that exists for the conversation, because immediately becomes like an ideological thing. I don't trust you. My ideology is different. I'm a public employee and you are the private. You want to make money and I'm here to defend the world. Okay, that's the, and it's neither nor. Right? I mean, yes, one is trying to make money, but that's obviously the definition of business. And the other one is a public employee, but, both are trying to make a living. I mean, just in different ways, right? And in both situations, you find good people, bad people, like anywhere else. That's my view of that. But when you put ideology, then you cannot have trust.
How do you view those kinds of initiatives by companies to work at the community level? Do you think that's a way of building the trust that is necessary? Or
yes.
Does it worry you?
No, it doesn't. However, it should be more organized. I give you an example that I found when I was working the US-Mexico border that for me wasn't that similar, not exactly the same example, but I think we can adapt the example to see where my concerns are. I think overall, yes, it builds trust. That's a big thing, but you need to be careful. Not because of the private business itself, because I think that both the intentions are very, very good, but we have to be very careful that it is really distributed in a fair way, that it's distributed in a way that really is more equitable, that it's distributed among the people that they really need, they have more that greatest need, and not where either the company wants to market itself and only, or not only where they feel more comfortable the government, or not where they have even the strongest NGO to do it. Because what happened is NGOs, they divide the land and they divide the communities, and there are some communities that they got stuck in the no man's land. If you see the map of services, was a total Swiss cheese.
Really?
So some places they got, more than the share of services that you expect, and some places had none. And why? Because of these kind of things. Because the private business, they didn't see that as a market on one hand, so they didn't, or they didn't even think about it. So in a way, you may have to force a little bit to say, oh no, go to these other communities as well.